Buckle Fills the Breach by St. John Pierce. Amongst the many and varied accomplishments of Bernard Buckle, that of singing cannot be numbered. This point was rather unduly stressed by his chum Gerald Pawson when the matter of the carol singing party was first discussed. "Of course we should be delighted to have you with us, Buckle," said Gerald. "And I don't want to be harsh, but really, your voice, you know." "I don't know," retorted Buckle. "What's the matter with my voice?" "I can't exactly say what's the matter with it. Anyway, it isn't what I should call a carol-singing voice. Too much like, I'm trying to put it delicately, too much like breaking coke." "That," returned Buckle coldly, "is a matter of opinion. I mean to say, it all depends on the audience. Now if the South Sea Islanders would hear me—" "Mr. Blertherer isn't a South Sea Islander," cut in Gerald. "Why isn't he? With a name like that?" asked Buckle. "Anyway, who is he?" "He's the Johnny we're chiefly out to please. If he likes our carol-singing party, he'll probably give us a fiver towards the cottage hospital funds." "Ah," broke in Buckle, with a significant nod. "You're right. I'm better out of this affair. You mean that Blerther is liable to biff you carol singers, and then bribe the hospital people to keep you there until the close of the carol-singing season?" "Not exactly," shrugged Gerald. "I thought I explained everything in my letter inviting you to spend Christmas with me." "You said nothing about carols." "Well, anyway, I meant to. It is a pity you can't sing." "How do you know I can't?" demanded Buckle. "Here, you sit down at the jolly old piano, and I'll show you whether I can sing or not. Do you know the Swanee River?" "I think I'd heard it." "Right, then thump it out." Gerald accordingly sat down at the piano, struck a chord, and then broke into the celebrated melody. Buckle glued his eyes to the ceiling, cleared his throat, opened his mouth, and chimed in about 4 bars too late, with a tune that bore not the slightest resemblance to the one Gerald was playing. "Stop!" yelled Gerald. "You've switched on to the wrong song." "Oldie world, I'm sad and—" "Shut up, Buckle. Everywhere I roam." "Wrong tune, you ass." "Oh, dark is how—" "What's the matter, Gerald?" "Only this," retorted Gerald. "You're mixing your tunes. You're about 1,000,000 bars out. You're as flat as a pancake, and I hate your voice." Buckle shook his head, sadly. "It's the old story of one singer being jealous of another," he sighed. "I'd like to have a second opinion. Look here. Let me come along to your rehearsal tonight, and let the others judge." "What's the use?" gritted Gerald. "They're all tip-top singers. Every one of them is in the choir. They'd give you the bird directly they heard your first note. No, Buckle. Keep your awful secret to yourself. I swear I'll not betray you." But Buckle was not to be put off, and after further argument, during which Buckle gave weird and wonderful renderings of the mistletoe bough and Good King Wenceslas, Gerald, as the only means of stopping the singer, consented to allow Buckle to accompany him to the rehearsal, which was taking place at the home of one Gibbons, the harmonium player. Some 2 hours later, Buckle found himself face to face with 2 altos and 3 trebles, in the persons of George Peebles, Henry Stocking, William Banks, Percy Heppelwaite, and Herbert Wagstaff. After the ceremony of introduction had been performed, Buckle was requested to show what he could do in the singing line. "Righto," nodded Buckle. "What would you chaps like to hear? Something classical, such as Only Once More or Never Again? Perhaps, however, you'd like a bit of syncopation." "Better try one of the carols," said Gibbons, sitting down at the small harmonium. "By the way, what is your voice?" "Eh? What do you mean by what is my voice?" cogitated Buckle. It depends. Feels a bit on the low side at the moment. Does it matter?" "Of course it matters. What's your compass?" "What's my water?" "Compass. You surely know what a compass is." "Something you make circles with," replied Buckle. "And I rather fancy," he added. "Then I shall be able to make rings round most of your voices once I get going." "As a matter of fact," chimed in Gerald, "the poor mutt can't sing for toffee. He only knows 2 tunes, one of which is God Save the King, and the other isn't. But he would come along here, and as he's stopping with me for the holes, I couldn't very well refuse. Look here, Buckle, you're only wasting time." "Oh, but I say," protested Buckle, "do let me give you a sample of one of my notes. Listen." And he shrilled a note that caused Gibbons nearly to fall off the music stool. The rest of the carol singers visibly winced. Buckle next gave vent to a growl, and then a squeak, after which in discordant tones he informed the company that "the mistletoe hung on the castle wall, the something bough hung in the old oak hall, the baron's retainers were tumpty and gay, keeping their Christmas holiday. Oh, the mistletoe bough," until the carol singers went for him and stuffed handkerchiefs down his throat. After that, a stern veto was put on any further vocal efforts on the part of Buckle, but after a lengthy discussion they so far relented as to allow him to assist to the extent of carrying the lantern. "And if you dare as much breathe a note," said Gerald, "you're for it, my lad. Understand?" "No," replied Buckle, "I really can't understand. Still, just as you like. Now let's hear what you can do." The carol singers accordingly obliged with their repertoire, during which time Buckle sat screwed up in his chair, in the attitude of one who is suffering from acute indigestion. During the week's interval that elapsed between Buckle's voice trial and the night that the carol singers were to sally forth, Buckle secretly went into the matter of his voice. He chose unfrequented lanes and fields, and with a 5-barred gate intervening, serenaded a dun-coloured bull, with the good news that good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen, and the snow lay round about, deep and crisp and even. The animal received the effort quite placidly, whereat Buckle was not without hope in the truth of the old saying that practice makes perfect. His hopes were somewhat dashed a quarter of an hour later, when a farm labourer interrupted the first verse of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen with a lengthy recipe for sore throats, from which distressing ailment he apparently imagined Buckle was suffering. Buckle, however, was not one to be easily cast down, and when he and Gerald Pawson and the rest of the carol singers met at the crossroads, Buckle was full of beans, and the only one present who did not seem to be at all nervous. "Just the right sort of weather," he observed, indicating the falling snowflakes. "Regular Christmas card scene. And how are all our voices?" "I've got a beastly cold," wheezed Herbert Wagstaff. "Doubt if I could sing a note." "Hard luck," commiserated Buckle. "Just give me the tip, and I'll chip in and give you a leg up with a top A or a bottom C or any other letter of the alphabet." "If it's all the same to you, Buckle," said Gerald coldly, "we prefer Wagstaff's cold to your voice. It may be peculiar of us, but there it is. Now are we all ready? Right. Off we get to Mr. Blerther's house." The party trudged off through the rapidly thickening snow, with loud sneezes on the part of Wagstaff, and coughing and snuffling from the others. Twice Banks and Heavyweight, who were carrying the harmonium, slipped and sat down violently. So what with one thing and another, the carol singers were hardly in the condition to give of their best by the time that they arrived at the abode of Mr. Blertherer. "Now, you chaps," said Gerald, "we'll take our stand by the gate. I see there's a light in his study window. All ready?" "Achoo!" sneezed Wagstaff. "By the way," said Buckle, "when do we start collecting the money?" "On Boxing Day," replied Gerald. "Now please don't chatter, Buckle. Give us the note, Gibbons." But before Gibbons could give anything, a melodious strain suddenly broke out from behind a belt of trees some 50 yards away. Clearly to their ears came that well-known carol of Christians Awake. In other words, a rival party of carol singers had got on the job first. Gibbon's hands crashed down on the harmonium keys in a gesture of disgust. "Chaps," he breathed. "That's the Deepwell Boys' Choir. The cats. They try to queer our pitch." In the frenzied minute that followed, Buckle gathered the information that the Deepwell boys had long been the bitter rivals of Gerald's friends, and that this action of theirs was well in keeping with their murky career. "Very well," gritted Gerald, starting to rapidly make snowballs. "We all teach the rotters that they can't." Gerald stopped short, for at that very moment snow missiles assailed them from all sides, and a second later a score of shadowy forms converged on them, swept them off their feet, rolled them in the snow, picked them up, downed them once more, and then finally chased them into the darkness. One, however, remained, and that one was Bernard Buckle. He sprawled, half buried in the snow, hopelessly mixed up in the harmonium, the stool, and the broken lantern, but otherwise in full possession of his faculties, and burning with a fierce determination to carry on with the carol singing at all costs. By the time Buckle had disentangled himself from the harmonium and risen to his feet, the two sets of carol singers were far away. Faint shouts came to his ears to tell that the pursuit continued, but Buckle, being helpless to do anything in the matter, turned his attention to the harmonium, and opening the lid, ran his fingers over the notes. Most of them giving forth sounds, Buckle decided that the instrument was playable, and pulling up the stool, sat down, and thoughtfully considered the situation. Buckle's skill as an instrumentalist was about on a par with his vocal abilities. He could nearly play Three Blind Mice and the Bluebells of Scotland with one finger, and the uppermost thought in his mind was, would these two tunes form an accompaniment for the singing of the Mistletoe Bough? Buckle glanced towards the lighted study window. "Quite a fair distance away," he ruminated. "The sound would only faintly reach old Blerthere, and probably wouldn't sound too bad. Hang it all, I'll risk it." With this valorous resolve, Buckle worked away at the pedals. Then his index finger alighted on one of the notes, another, and another, until he had worked out the opening bars of Three Blind Mice. He repeated this until he was quite sure of the position of each note, and this done, he cleared his throat, preparatory to bursting into song. Before, however, this could happen, from beneath the gates of the Blerthere domain scrambled a dog, and with a grunt and a growl it circled round Buckle and the harmonium, with every sign of strong disapproval of both. "Love a duck," muttered Buckle. "What's to be done now? Shoo! Go away, you little beast." But the dog only growled and snapped the more, and with each growl he lessened the circle around Buckle and the harmonium. Buckle, at his wit's end, suddenly recollected a certain well-known quotation to the effect that music hath charms to soothe the savage heart, although with a passing doubt as to whether it wasn't breast and not heart. Still, there was no time to hesitate, and accordingly he promptly put the matter to the test. Plunk went his hands on as many notes as he could hit, and at the same time he shrilled forth, "The mistletoe hung on the castle wall, the—" The dog stopped, sat on its haunches, and gave vent to a long and dismal howl. Buckle redoubled his efforts, and the conglomerate result was somewhat like the following. "The mistletoe hung on the— yip, 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 ow! The holly bough, ow! The baron's retainers were— grrr! Oh, the mistletoe, ow! Yip, yip, ow!" Somewhere about this point Buckle's voice gave out, but he continued to work the pedals like mad, and to thump away at the notes for dear life. Obviously the dog was impressed by the music, in the same way that a snake is charmed by an Indian piper. True, the dog's howls were capable of a more sinister construction, but Buckle was ever one to hope for the best. So Buckle played on, and the dog duetted with mortal vigour, until, as the old writers of romance would say, the welkin rang. Whilst all this was going on, inside the house sat old Mr. Blerthere, listening to his 5-valve set, quite unconscious of the performance going on at his gates. Down in the kitchen sat Mr. Bletherer's manservant and wife, who blissfully imagined that Buckle and the dog was all part and parcel of the classical concert to which their master was listening. Neither of these worthy people had the slightest ear for music. Besides, they were slightly deaf, and the kitchen lay well at the back. Presently, however, the wireless came to a stop, and for the first time Mr. Bletherer became aware of sounds nearer home. He sat up and listened, wondering for the moment if his set had been switched on to some new foreign station. Deciding after a few minutes that it hadn't, he rose to his feet, crossed the study, opened the door and bellowed, "Thompson! Thompson!" No Thompson forthcoming, he groped his way downstairs and burst into the kitchen. "Thompson!" he snapped. "What is that unearthly row going out in the front?" "Row, sir?" echoed Thompson. "Didn't hear no row, sir. Thought it was your wireless, sir." "My wireless?" rapped out Mr. Bletherer. "Don't be absurd, Thompson. It sounds as if someone was in pain, and listen! That's surely Rover howling." "It do sound like the dog, sir," nodded Mrs. Thompson. "I said the same to my husband not 10 minutes ago." "Nonsense, woman," snapped Mr. Bletherer. 10 minutes ago the Popinoff symphony was being played. How could that resemble a... It is Rover. But there's some sort of musical instrument as well. We must investigate." "Yes, sir. Certainly, sir," mumbled Thompson, slowly starting to kick off his carpet slippers. "At once! There must be no delay." Thompson groped about for a thick pair of boots, muffled himself up, and in a short time joined his master in the hall. Similarly enveloped, Mr. Bletherer stood by the front door, a stout stick in either hand. One of these he held out to Thompson. "One cannot be too careful," he observed, "in these days of cat burglars." "Beg pardon, sir, but I thought you said it was a dog." "Thompson," said Mr. Bletherer, "don't be a fool." As they cautiously opened the front door, they became aware the nature of the sounds had changed. True, Rover was still barking and growling, but the musical instrument was now silent. Many voices, however, were muttering in the direction of the gates, a fact that caused Mr. Bletherer to hesitate on the top step. "We must proceed cautiously, Thompson," he whispered. "It will be wiser to creep forward and just see what is happening before we make our presence known." "Yes, sir. Certainly, sir," replied Thompson, with great thankfulness. And in the meantime, what of Buckle? Well, Buckle, at the moment that Mr. Bletherer emerged from the house, had suddenly discovered that he was surrounded by the hostile Deepwell Boys' Choir. Quite unnoticed by him, they had crept up to where he sat, and it was not until the dog scampered away that Buckle was aware of their proximity. Then it was too late to escape. "Look here," said the leader of the enemy. "What do you think you're doing?" "Carol singing," replied Buckle. Didn't sound much like carols." "I must own," said Buckle, "that the dog wasn't quite in tune. I mean to say." "Sounded a ghastly row," cut in the other. "I say, do you belong to that gang we chased away?" "In a matter of speaking, I did," replied Buckle, cautiously. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean I wasn't one of the singers, a sort of follower, part of the crowd, a portion of their gait." "Then you do belong to them. Come on, chaps, let's give 'em what for." But Buckle, with a lightning dive, wriggled beneath their outstretched hands, and made for Mr. Bletherer's gates. He reached them, just as Mr. Bletherer and Thompson opened them, preparatory to springing out on the carol singers, and with a thud, Buckle's head came in contact with Thompson's chest. "Ouch!" gasped that faithful servant, staggering back, with Buckle in his arms. Weighing, however, about 13 stone, Thompson kept his balance. He also kept Buckle, by gripping him by the shoulders and holding him as if in a vice. "It's only a boy, sir," he whispered. The word boy reassured Mr. Bletherer. for the moment, had half turned to beat a rapid retreat. "Hold him tightly, Thompson," he shouted. "He shall be made an example. You others," he addressed the Deepwell faction, "come here." The Deepwell boys rather unwillingly advanced. "Listen," snapped Mr. Blerther. "One more sound from you and I will telephone the police." "But, sir," interrupted the leader, "we didn't make that row. We're the Deepwell choir and—" "Silence!" cut in Mr. Blerther. "I refuse to listen either to your singing or to any explanation you may make. My own ears are enough evidence for me. Not another word. Go away." "Really, sir, go away." And as there was nothing else to do, the Deepwell boys retired. The unfortunate Buckle was led back to the house, and eventually came to a halt in Mr. Blerther's study. "Now, young man," frowned Mr. Blerther, "what have you got to say for yourself? If that's how they teach you to sing at Deepwell, then I'm sorry for Deepwell." Buckle thought for a moment or so. "Well, sir," he said, "Deepwell was only able to send over their third 11 this evening. I mean to say, the lot you heard aren't a patch on the fellows who live about here. No, sir, now if you could only hear them, they're something like—" "If they are, I don't want to hear them," snapped Mr. Blerther. "Of all the frightful noises." At that moment, faintly to their ears came the strains of Good King Wenceslas, and Mr. Blerther, with a bound, made for the front door, yelling loudly for Thompson once more to accompany him outside. This, after a short delay, Thompson did, and Buckle went with them as well. But no sooner was the front door open than they became aware that a very different performance was taking place from that to which they had previously listened. The singing was really quite good, and Mr. Blerther halted and nodded his approval. "Now, this is more like the real thing," he observed. "Far more like the real thing. Perhaps," he turned to Buckle, "these are the singers from this locality." Buckle listened for a moment. Then a high note struck him as being reminiscent. "Sounds like old Gerald's top M," he thought. "If so, everything in the garden's lovely. Yes, it is Gerald. Good egg. Yes, sir," he added aloud. "I'm sure they aren't Deepwell voices. Shall I just run on ahead and tell them you're coming?" And suiting the action to the word, Buckle wriggled free from Thompson's detaining hand and made a dash for the gates. He got there just as the carol finished. It was Gerald Pawson & Co. Right enough. "Splendid! Splendid!" breathed Buckle. "You!" ejaculated Gerald in huge surprise. "How on earth did you—" "Shush! Here comes Mr. Blerther." Mr. Blerther waddled up, beaming all over his face. "Capital!" he applauded. "When you have sung one more, I should like you to all come inside. You!" He wheeled round on Buckle. "I hope you will listen very attentively, so that when you return to Deepwell, you will have at least learnt something about singing." But whatever Buckle may have learnt about singing, Mr. Blerther never learnt the exact details containing Buckle's part in the business. Yet the fact remained that it wasn't so much Gerald Pawson & Co.'s good singing as Buckle's horrible singing that extracted a £5 note from Mr. Blerther for the cottage hospital funds. This Buckle took great pains to point out during the journey back home. "If it hadn't been for me, Deepwell would have won hands down," he said. "Oh, yes, they would." "Shut up. It was all a beastly fluke, if you ask me," said Gerald. "I reckon from what you say the dog helped us as much as anything." "Maybe," sighed Buckle. "Anyway, between the pair of us, our notes have resulted in a £5 note, and that's really all that matters." Which, after all, was the truth.